Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to Late Night Learning. I am your host, Dr. Anthony Palomba. Today, in our part 3 portion of the survey lecture that we have today, we're going to be going through non-probability sampling. We were just going through probabilistic sampling, and so here we're going to be talking about non-probabilistic sampling. Now, non-probabilistic sampling is not ideal, but sometimes we don't have the resources to pay for surveys to be disseminated, and sometimes we don't have the opportunity to really spend the necessary energy to make sure that we have a randomized sample. And it doesn't necessarily mean that we can't learn from our own survey results, but it does mean that we are severely limited, and there really isn't any generalizability whatsoever with a non-probabilistic sample. Nevertheless, though, this is regularly implemented, and it is important to note that this is still a technique that is used. After all, if you are surveyed after leaving St. John's University, or if you are surveyed after leaving Starbucks coffee shop, that's kind of a non-probabilistic way of sampling people, right? Was it really randomized? Not really. There was no population list, and you weren't really randomly selected, you were able to simply be selected to take the survey, but you also aren't really part of a population list. And so it's important to note that non-probability is actually used way more than we might think. Let's get started. And so with non-probability sampling, it's super useful if you cannot conduct randomized sampling. It's really useful for exploratory studies. You might be developing a video game, and you may be saying to yourself, well, I don't know what people think about humans invading an alien planet and destroying the alien planet. I mean, what if we just flipped the script and we did that? I don't really have the budget. My boss is really riding me on this. I don't really have the time to go look for a random sample. Maybe I can just go to a middle school, or maybe go to a toy store, or video game arcade, or Dave & Buster's, and just maybe give some surveys out and maybe just get a sense of what people think. And in those places, I'm targeting younger children or people who play video games. People play video games at Dave & Buster's. And so that might be a good way to kind of explore, is there any potential for this kind of video game? Let's go back to the slide. And so you are limited with statistical significance here and generalizability. There are advantages, though. You do have reduced costs here, and it does allow lists to be created without a population, as I previously stated. But there is an increase in standard error. After all, you might, for whatever reason, have a ton of African Americans, or a ton of younger girls, or a ton of Hispanic Americans, or a ton of casual gamers, right? Your quotas might be all over the place because really you're just sending out a survey to whomever. You're not really controlling for anything else. So you want to be mindful of this as you're moving along in non-probabilistic sampling. It gives you an idea of what your results may look like, but it's important to not go over the cliff with them, so to speak. Let's go to the next slide. And so there are 4 non-probabilistic sampling techniques to be mindful of. One is a convenience sample. So participants are pulled in a number of ways to take the survey. Many of you listening to this are college students. You may have seen surveys being given out in one of the common squares at St. John's, or you may be seeing surveys being given out on the quad, or whatever it may be. It's a convenience sample. Conveniently, we're having who is available take the survey. We're not really filtering out anybody. If they look like a student, they're going to take the survey, or they'll be asked to take it. We also have something called a purposive sample. The researcher seeks samples from a particular population. Purposive sample may include a whole host of things. It could very well be that I'm really only interested in people who have survived brain cancer, let's say, or I'm only interested in people who have survived lung cancer. Okay, so I may not be able to get a randomized sample from a list of US adults who have suffered and conquered lung cancer. What I can do is that I can go to maybe 5 random hospitals in the area. I can see if the hospital will allow me to approach patients there or patients who have just recovered from lung cancer and give out the surveys. Quota sampling is somewhat related to purpose of sample here. Researcher seeks to have sample meet a particular quota. And so I use the lung cancer survivor example here as well. It could very well be that I need 40 people to take the survey who have beaten lung cancer and 40 people who have beaten brain cancer to take the survey. Fine. What I may do then is I may go randomly to hospital to ensure that I have the quota. But again, I don't have a population list here, and I'm not using a randomized technique. There is something else called a snowball sample. You can ask participants here to identify other participants for future participation. I went to school at Syracuse University for my master's. When I was there, there was a fellow grad student who was looking to send a survey out to the LGBTQ community. And so, as you can imagine, especially some 7 or 8 years before this broadcast, identifying as a homosexual, identifying as a lesbian, identifying as gay was still something that a lot of people were very hesitant to do. And so she struggled finding LGBTQ members to take the survey. And so she implemented a snowball survey. Essentially, if she could find somebody from that population, she would ask them, oh, hey, do you know anybody else who identifies as an LGBTQ member to take the survey? Are you aware of anyone? Do you know anyone? Can I talk to anyone? And so that's another way to keep going, especially with populations that are difficult to find. Snowball sampling works out very, very well. Let's keep going. Survey sampling and measurement errors, tips and tricks. So in this, we're going to be examining different errors and kind of how to combat them as we collect data and as we are mindful about what we're analyzing here. Let's move along. Survey errors, sampling errors. So you may have a sample error. You may say to yourself, well, I wanted hardcore gamers, but the people who took my survey are more middle of the road gamers. So my sample really doesn't reflect the population that I'm after. I could very well have random errors, as you ladies and gentlemen might imagine. After all, a hardcore gamer may be defined as someone who plays video games for upwards of 20 hours or more. Somebody who may be a mid-core gamer may only play video games for about 10 hours a week. Still substantial, but certainly nothing like a hardcore gamer. So in order to reduce the errors associated with this, increase your sample size. If you don't have enough African Americans, if you don't have enough hardcore gamers, recruit more. This will help deflate your sampling error here. Let's move along. Sampling bias. So sometimes we might have a sampling bias that we're not cognizant of. Coverage bias is a very, very big one. Some participants may be excluded from the survey. And so it very well may be that some participants may not be included because they don't have access to the internet or they don't have access to something here. And so because of that, you may lose out on a broad swath of your population. To reduce this problem, define the population. If your population is of U.S. adults who have internet access and use the internet on their phones, make sure that that is abundantly clear. That will help reduce coverage bias. Selection bias. Some participants may have higher or lower chances of being selected for the survey itself. After all, if I'm always drinking Starbucks coffee and I'm always swiping my loyalty card, I may very well have a greater opportunity to be selected for the survey than other people. You want to be mindful of this if you're Starbucks headquarters and you're putting out a survey. And so you want to be sure here that you implement randomized sampling so that it's not just people who are always drinking your coffee who are selected. Finally, with non-response bias, some participants may be unable to respond to the survey. After all, some of our grandparents may not have a smartphone, or maybe they have a jitterbug, which is a giant smartphone or phone so that they can see the screen. but it may not always be internet compatible or sophisticated for that matter. And so you want to be mindful of these things, especially if you're going to send a senior citizen population a survey over the phone. You want to be mindful of this because they may not be able to respond to the survey itself. You want to think about other ways in which you may raise the rate of response with your survey. And so because of that, then, what you may do is you may restructure the survey so that senior citizens can take it. Maybe it appears bigger on the screen. Maybe it's shorter. Other things that you can do to help ensure your response rate increases. Let's keep moving. Non-sampling errors. You may have an interview error. If there is an interviewer for each survey instrument, there may be errors. Of course there may be. You may wrongly explain what is defined as brain cancer or what is defined as some other disease to a senior citizen who you're interviewing, right? Because you may be interviewing the senior citizen so that you can ask them the survey questions and then fill in the bubbles yourself for them because they may be unable to. And so because of this, you may have errors because you wrongly explained a particular concept. There is something also known as response errors. Reporting, comprehension, and knowledge may vary across your interviewees. Maybe one of the people you trained to interview senior citizens didn't properly explain something, as I stated with interview errors. There are also coding errors. And so somebody may code brain cancer as 1 and lung cancer as 2, and then somebody may code brain cancer as 2 and lung cancer as 1. And so you may have issues if people are manually collecting data. You want to be vigilant over hired interviewers. You want to properly monitor and clean data, and you want to proof the survey design itself. Let's keep moving. There are different types of validities. And let me stop here to say I know once again that I am throwing quite a bit at you. And I want to recognize that you're doing a fine job. Keep moving along here. I do recognize this is a lot of content, but it will make more sense as you move along in this class and as you move along in your own careers. With different types of validities, you really do want to think about, are you measuring what you think you're measuring here? Face validity states, on its face, the question appears to be measuring what it is measuring. Is that the case? When you ask people what their favorite colas are, or if you ask people what their favorite sodas are, do some people think iced tea is a soda or a cola or a soft drink? They may. And so you may need to edit certain portions of your question so that on its face it measures what it claims to be measuring. Maybe we get rid of iced tea, or maybe we specify iced tea is included as a soft drink. Concurrent validity. Your measurement should be able to identify different groups within participants. Concurrent validity states then that you should be able to identify people who are low-core video game players, mid-core video game players, and hardcore video game players. Your survey question should be able to identify people who don't really watch reality TV, who kind of watch reality TV, who really watch reality TV, right? That's concurrent validity. You want to be sure that you can identify different participants. Fine. Two last validities. Convergent validity, measurements should measure similar items, should vary in the same direction, and do so. So if people who have a lot of brand loyalty toward Bravo watch a lot of reality TV in another question scale on the survey instrument, both of those should increase together and decrease together, right? So that should make sense for convergent validity. Measurements should do that. Discriminant validity, measurements that measure for different items should vary in opposite directions. And so what this may mean here is that, for instance, you may have a situation in which people who watch a lot of sports don't really watch a lot of reality TV. After all, there are only 24 hours in a day, right? So the more people are watching sports, the less they should be watching other stuff. That should make sense here. And discriminant validity also looks for that. Measurements that measure for different items should vary in different directions. Additionally, you may ask people what the temperature is outside. You may ask them how many layers of clothing they have on. If there's discriminant validity here, the hotter the day is, the less clothing people should be wearing, right? It should be, those two measurements should be varying in opposite directions. Let's keep going. Threats to external validity. The ability for us to generalize our results. We do have threats here that we have to be mindful of before we can generalize our results from the survey. First, randomization is critical here. How representative is the population? That's an important question to ask. You'll know this based on whether or not you implemented a probabilistic sampling technique or a non-probabilistic sampling technique. Sampling error. How close is your sample to being descriptive of your population? To combat this, you want to ensure that you have a large sample. Let's move along. Threats to internal validity. How well have you controlled the study? How well have you controlled for outside influences? This is critical here. For history, what's going on currently? What's going on in society? Don't tell me that people love buying toys and have been buying toys all the time if you put your survey out in late November or early December. History would say it's the holidays. People have Hanukkah, they have Christmas. There's a lot of purchases going on. So when you send out your survey, be mindful of what's going on. Did we just have an election? Is a holiday coming up? What's impacting people's answers here? Another thing to think about is maturation. And those of you who have had me live in class know I do group activities and I give my students breaks. Why? Because you get fatigued, you get tired, you get hungry, you get thirsty, you need to use the restroom, you need a mental break. This also happens in research. You want to be careful for how long you have your participants working. Is your survey 20 questions long? Is it 30 questions long? How long is your survey going? Additionally, we have statistical regression. Tendency for scores and responses from participants to fall back toward the mean in future replications. So you may have a survey that you give out one summer that says, kids really love the beach. Oh my God. But then you may do it the next summer and you may say, oh, the scores are a little bit lower. And then the next summer, they may go up a little bit. You can see, if you keep giving out the survey, it's likely to have numbers regress toward a mean. It's just important to understand that there will be variation with your data if you replicate the study in the future. Sample selection. Some participants may be selected who aren't directly connected to the population that is being sampled. Again, screeners, filters, use those to ensure that your sample is as close to the ideal population as possible. Experimental mortality. Do participants drop out of your study? Yeah, some participants may not respond to each survey question. Some participants may not answer every bit that you have for them. And so these are some threats to internal validity to be mindful of as you're going through your own results. Let's keep going. Additional threats to validity here. Testing. Are participants aware of what you are trying to understand? You want to be sure that the way that you ask questions and in the order that you ask these questions, participants aren't detecting what your primary focus is of your survey. And in order to really do this, one, it takes practice, and two, you want to think about the order here as well. When you nail these things down, it will become easier and easier to ensure participants aren't picking up on anything. Instrumentation, did you change any instruments during the research study? Did you add a question last year to that survey about the beach that you didn't include here? If so, that might impact respondents' answers to other questions as well. Demoralization. Participants may lose interest in a study. They may get bummed out that they're in the control group. I didn't get to try the fruity drinks that the other survey participants got to try. Well, that kind of is a disappointment. Social desirability is another item to consider with internal validity. Participants respond as they believe the researchers wish for them to. Oh no, as we've stated earlier, I don't watch the Kardashians. I always watch PBS. Or yeah, no, I really like these Oreo cookies. They're awesome. Even though I may not believe that, I may think to myself, well, I kind of think this is what the respondents or the researchers want anyway. Let me just answer in this light. Let's keep going. Industry, survey, raw data. We have a few more slides after this. We are in the home stretch, ladies and gentlemen. Just bear with me. Again, I recognize that this is a lot that is being thrusted upon you, but please review this video if you need to. As for the others as well, I always encourage rereading your notes and getting a sense of this. I recognize this is a lot. Let's keep going. Competitive set. And so what you may want to think about here is what brands or competitors or segment that you want to look at in your survey. In your survey, for instance, you may say to yourself, well, we are MTV. Our competitors may include Bravo, may include E, may include TNT, or other channels for that matter. And so you want to think about how many channels or how many competitors you want to account for in your survey, right? If you're Netflix, you may be worried about Amazon Prime and you may be worried about HBO. And so you may say to yourself, well, the questions I'm about to ask about brand loyalty, intent to purchase, and subscribe, maybe I just want to focus on me, which may be Netflix, and I want to focus on 3 competitors, Hulu, Amazon, and HBO. And so for each question, I'm going to include those competitors as well because I want to see what my respondents are going to say about me compared to other competitors. And so it's kind of important to think about this because it's also going to help inform how you're going to be reporting the results here. Let's move along. Tabs and banners. And so this is something that a lot of companies use as a way in which to share data and information. And so this may sometimes be showcased as a summary table in an Excel spreadsheet, the data itself, in which all answer options in a question are shown. It's typically reserved for grid questions. And so typically you'll have this data output and you're going to see an example of it. As we know, most questions are asked in the following manner. You know, on a scale of 1 to 5, what do you think of A, B, and C? On a scale of 1 to 7, what do you think of A, B, and C? And so for here, what you'll see following is what a data output may look like. Let's go to the next slide. And so this is an example of output that you may get at your firm. So your firm may crunch numbers or you may be sent raw data from the survey itself, and this is a way in which to understand it. And so this is what an output may look like. So these are banner points. Okay. So at the top left box, you can see the question here. How likely are you to recommend Nintendo to others? Fine. You can see below it, it's on a scale of 1 to 5. After all, we have not at all, not very, somewhat significant, highly significant, very significant. We have something here called a base. The base describes who answered the question. So if people had awareness of Nintendo, they were asked or they skipped to this question to respond to. That is what a base is. A base here means awareness of brand. So only people who claim to have awareness of Nintendo were asked this question. And so a floating base here means that the bases or total participants who answered the question may vary. This could be based on awareness of a brand, usage of a brand, or even those who have seen an advertisement. And so here you can see some of the screened participants as we were discussing earlier. You may see parents of children 0 to 2 who own a Nintendo console, parents of children 0 to 5 who own a Nintendo console, and teenagers. And the teenager's age should probably be specified here, but we can assume it's 13 to 17 years old. Fine. Along the base row, you can see the number of participants who took the question. Who answered the question? 266 respondents were parents of children 0 to 2 who owned a Nintendo console, and so on and so forth there. That is what those numbers are. And so for here, you can see that at least for very significant, which is number 5, you look across the row here, you can see the numbers 39, 43, and 90. Those are the actual numbers of respondents who answered 5 for them to be able to recommend Nintendo. Below it, you can see percentages, 15%, 17%, and 30%, as you're reading from left to right in the very significant row. And so that is the percentage then of what the counts mean versus other responses. So it looked like 15% of parents of children 0 to 2 who own a Nintendo console were very, very inclined or were selected very significant for how likely they are for recommending Nintendo to other people. And so this is an instance in which people are stating that they believe the Nintendo brand is very significant and they are very inclined to recommend Nintendo. And so as you're looking at this particular banner point, you can see that a lot is going on there. This concludes our survey lecture. As you can see, there's a lot going on with the survey method. There are a lot of different methods that we can use to secure a sample. There are a lot of different ways that we can write questions. And ultimately, it's going to be up to you to determine how you want to craft your survey. It is very likely that you will struggle with designing a survey at first, but do not be discouraged. To this day, I continue to rewrite and write questions as I've said in previous lectures. It doesn't end and it doesn't change. Have fun drafting surveys and questionnaires. They're a lot of fun, and a lot of the insights that you glean can be very, very useful to you. Well, that's all the time we have on Late Night Learning. As always, keep laughing and keep learning.